Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my deep dive series where I've started from the back of the pack and I'm working my way to the front of the pack. So this week I will be doing a deep dive into Mercedes and kind of comparing them against those constructors that finished around them in the constructor standings. And then I'll also dive into the two Mercedes drivers and kind of compare them to the drivers championship and where they finished in the drivers championship to the drivers around them. Now, Mercedes has moved up from that fourth spot in 2024 up to the second spot in that constructors standings in 2025. Now, how did they do that? Basically, they had to avoid the reliability issues that a lot of the other teams had, so they were pretty stable across the board. And they had where they were able to bank some really good points on almost every race. And so they kind of built up that, points haul that they were making. Russell, was able to do a win in Canada and Singapore, which helped them out quite a bit. In fact, Russell was doing really consistent across the board, where he only finished outside the top 6 out of those 24 races. And so he's getting those good points through most of those races. The car was, I said, was in a nice spot where they had cool conditions that were able to take advantage of those situations and perform the best in that Mercedes. So it wasn't quite as well rounded as they would have liked, but they had some really good runs. Kimi came in and was, doing a good job as a rookie. He was a little bit inconsistent, but of course that's what you expect from a rookie and a little bit of that stuff, but he had really good drives and actually was on the podium 3 times this season, which is really good to jump in on a rookie year. Now, if you're going to compare those drivers a little bit, you can basically go in there and say Kimi, out sprint qualified Russell 2 out of the 6 times. And for those sprint races, he outperformed him 1 out of those 6 times. So he dropped back a little bit in those sprint races, when compared to Russell. Now for the GP races, he outqualified Russell 3 out of the 24 times, and he outperformed him in those finishing positions on those GP races 3 out of 24 times. So now if you go look at the results from Russell's standpoint, if you don't want to do the math, he basically outperformed Kimi on those sprint qualifyings 4 out of the 6 times, but ended up in that sprint races, outperforming Kimi 5 out of the 6 times. Now, it looked a little bit different on the GP races, as we said earlier, where he outperformed qualified Kimi Antonelli 21 out of the 24 times, and he outperformed him in those final spots on those GP races 21 out of the 24 times. So he was really, the dominant player here in the Mercedes, but of course, Kimi was still up there doing good performances and helped them pull that Mercedes with those 2 finishing drivers ahead of the Red Bull, which basically had Max in that spot. And so it kind of helped them pull ahead of the Red Bulls and the Ferraris that they were having a more rough season this past 2025 year than they were expecting. Now here's a little bit of a chart that kind of shows you some of those functionalities for Mercedes throughout the season, where they were started off in that 4th position last time, and they were moved up to that 2nd position in 2025. They had an average sprint qualifying position of 6.8 and an average finishing of those sprint races in a 6.2. So slightly up, almost a full place, but not quite that far up, but still decently into the points on average. So they were getting points on those sprint races when they needed to. Now for the GP races, they average qualified in that 6.6, so it's slightly higher than the sprint races. And they averaged a 7.2 finishing position on those GP races. So a little bit farther down, but still within good points for every race that they get on those GP races. They only had 4 DNFs, and it all happened in GP races. Now, if you break that down into the 2 drivers, you can see Kimi Antonelli coming in from last year with not being ranked and moved up to 7th this year. He had an average 7.8 sprint qualifying position, and that same for the sprint finishing position of 7.8. And you move over to the GP races, he moved back a position, an average qualifying position of 8.8, and he dropped back to 9.8 for the finishing positions for those GP races. And he had all 4 of those DNFs for the team, and they all happened in those GP races. So you can get a look at that there and kind of figure out that rookie coming in, having a little bit of mistakes, not having quite the confidence or the ability to really tune that car to his liking straight off the bat. And so that kind of played into the things, being a little bit inconsistent, but of course still up there in the points on average, getting good points for Mercedes. And you compare him to George Russell, who was 6th last year in that 2024 season and moved up to 4th this past year in the 2025 season. And so we'll have to see how he does in the 2026 season when they're coming up. And it sounds like they have a good, at least strong engine. We'll have to see if that, aerodynamics matches that and they're able to pull forward. Anyway, his average sprint qualifying position was a 5.7. And he moved that up to a 4.5 for those finishing those sprint races. So he moved up a good position on those, and instead getting decent points on average for those sprint races. And for the GP races, he was starting those qualifying positions at 4.4, and he basically stayed the same in those finishing GP races, averaging a 4.5. So right up there in that top 5 for every race on average was really good to see for George Russell. And he had 0 DNFs. And this is the comparison of those Mercedes drivers in those 6 sprint races. And I love it how they kind of match up between those drivers, as you can tell basically where that Mercedes was bad at on the tracks versus what was good at. And then you can compare the drivers on a more consistent basis. And so you can kind of see here, both of those drivers started off in decent shape, but got better throughout the season as that Mercedes was developed and upgrades happened to those Mercedes and able to get the most out of that, being familiar with that car. Of course, having that one-off in Belgium, as that track didn't really suit the Mercedes, as you can tell, as both drivers kind of fell back in that pack. But then, of course, you got the comparison there where Brazil, Kimi Antonelli was able to get ahead of his teammate George Russell. And here we're comparing, Kimi Antonelli against Alexander Albon and Lewis Hamilton, those drivers that finished around him in the Drivers' Championship, and looking at those same 6 sprint races. And so you can kind of compare those drivers, how they played out throughout the season. As you can see, like Lewis Hamilton started off very strong, but ended up not so great at the end of the season, so getting worse throughout the season, where Kimi Antonelli was getting better throughout the season. And Alexander Albon was pretty constant in that 11th position across this board for those sprint races. And you can kind of compare how those drivers played out in each of those races, all having a bad off in Belgium, which was kind of interesting to see, and coming back in Austin doing decently. Just kind of comparing those results and figuring out where those teams were good and where their teams were maybe not so good, and how the drivers handled those cars. And of course, this is a look for George Russell compared to Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri, those drivers that finished around him in the Drivers' Championship, and looking at those same 6 sprint races. And here you can see that George Russell is fairly consistent. He had that little bit of off in Belgium, but came back fairly strong for those next 3 sprint races. Whereas, Oscar had those really good 3 sprint races and then fell back for the next 2, and then ended up recovering in Qatar. And Charles Leclerc, had that one off in Miami that was really bad, and then did decently for the next 3, but then fell off a little bit in Qatar as well. And you can kind of see those trend lines as how they played out, where, again, George Russell was getting better throughout the year fairly significantly, where Charles Leclerc was slightly getting better throughout the season, just barely, but pretty much stable. And Oscar Piastri was kind of getting worse because of those offs in Austin and Brazil. And here we're comparing both of those Mercedes drivers against the GP races across the season. And so you can kind of look at this and kind of compare how well they did on those full GP races. And of course, this is the more important race, where it had the most points to be earned for each of those races. And you're going to compare those, and you still get an idea of roughly how that Mercedes was doing race by race, as some of those dropped back a little bit. But you also can see how George Russell, the more veteran driver, can adapt to those situations a little bit better than Kimi Antonelli has in that rookie season. So he will probably get better as he gets more experience and learning how to handle those situations. But again, you can see the nice comparison where Kimi was slightly back behind his teammate, but still getting better throughout the season, where George Russell is pretty constant across that board in that, made just above that 5th position. And here we're comparing Kimi Antonelli against Alexander Albon and Lewis Hamilton in those GP races. and kind of figure out where they line up. And you can kind of see that, Lewis Hamilton was doing a better job at the beginning of the season and kind of fell off at the end of the season, not quite where he needed to be on that Ferrari. And then Kimi Antonelli was kind of an up and down mix, kind of not quite as consistent as he should be, but still getting some good results, helping Mercedes out. And then, of course, Alexander Albon starting really good at the beginning, in that fifth marker for the most part, and then kind of slowly falling back, still being a little bit more inconsistent in that Williams as they're transitioning over to a different style of how they're developing that car, but still doing fairly well throughout the season and just getting worse throughout the season, not quite as able to take advantage of those updates that Williams brought compared to the Mercedes that was brought on by Kimi in that style of play. And here we're comparing George Russell against Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri in those GP races. And here what I really like to see on that George Russell is how consistent he was. Yes, he had a couple of offs like in Monaco and maybe Great Britain, where he was a little bit farther back in the pack, but generally he was, really up there in that top 5 for the most of the field, most of the season, as well as just how he really constantly, in that spot, showing how well he can do in that Mercedes and take the full advantage of that Mercedes, even though it wasn't the perfect car in this season compared to the other teams like McLaren, but was able to take advantage of that. Whereas Charles Leclerc, is a great driver and pushed that Ferrari as much as he could, but then of course had a lot more offs because that Ferrari wasn't quite as stable in those situations where they had to, figure out how to deal with those situations in and try to get dialed in. So he had a few more offs than George Russell, and of course Oscar had a couple of those bad ones at the end where it kind of hurt him overall. And here we're comparing the two Mercedes drivers and the points scored per race, and so you're on the GP races, and so you're kind of looking at that throughout this mix, and you kind of can tell where they were getting their points and how much they were getting their points compared to each other Mercedes. And you can see that George Russell was ahead of his teammate Kimi Antonelli, quite significantly on those point standings, about really steady across the board, getting about 14 points, per race on average, where Kimi was getting better throughout this season, but started off back, in that 4-point marker, but ended up closer to that 10-point marker by the end of the season on that, trend line, showing that he was getting better because he was going up and saying he's getting more points at the end of the season than he was at the beginning. And he had that middle stint where he was having a little bit of trouble in the Mercedes, but was able to finally gather himself and get back in line. And that probably helps him in this coming season as he's kind of more used to how to deal with those situations. And this is that same information for those two Mercedes drivers and those points, but in a step graph format, so you can kind of see how well George Russell was able to be consistently ahead of his teammate on getting points and getting that gap between him and Kimi as that season went on. Now here we're comparing the team in those sprint races compared to the teams around them, so Red Bull and McLaren, and you can kind of see how they performed against those teams in those sprint races where, Mercedes was pretty constant, getting decent points, but not quite as well as the McLaren was. They started off just ahead of them and getting really good points in, of course, Miami and Belgium, and then fell off a little bit, but came back in Qatar as well to, outshine that Mercedes in those point standings, even though it's showing that, he's getting worse throughout the season. For McLaren, it was slightly, downtrend, whereas Mercedes was doing a pretty good uptrend on these sprint races, as well as Red Bull was. And you kind of feel that out, but, they started out a little bit slow compared to McLaren, and that kind of hurt them in that regard. And here we're seeing that same point standing for those sprint races for the teams in the step graph format, so you can kind of see the ebbs and flows if you're just looking at the sprint races for these teams. And you can see, of course, McLaren, outshining the other two teams, Red Bull and Mercedes, but they were kind of entwined in that battle between those two teams as, getting ahead of 1 point and then dropping back on another, but ended up ahead of Red Bull by the end on those sprint race, points. And here we're looking at the points on those GP races for those teams. And of course, you can see how well McLaren drivers, were handling those points and getting a lot of points almost every single race, comparative to the Red Bull and Mercedes. But Mercedes was able to outshine the Red Bull on quite a significant number of those, helping them edge out the Red Bull at the end. So you can kind of look at that and look at those trend lines, and you can see that Red Bull is gaining ground on Mercedes through that trend line, but not quite fast enough to pull ahead by the end of the season, where Mercedes was pretty constant throughout the season, and McLaren was going down throughout the season, but started off so strong that it didn't really matter in that front. And if you're looking for those points step graph format just for the GP races, here's that information here, and you can kind of tell that Mercedes was doing a little bit better job on a consistent basis on those GP races than Red Bull was, staying ahead of them, not quite so entwined in the battle, but still on that verge of being passed by Red Bull. So they were still on that edge, but not quite as switching positions as we saw in these sprint races. And it's time for you to pull out your magnifying glass and do your memory game and try to figure out what the difference is between this graph and just the GP graph shown a little bit earlier, as this is the one that's combined with the sprint races, to try to give you an idea how well or how little the sprint races affected the whole GP constructor standings, as the GP races have the more points involved, and how they have a few sprint races in the season as well. So here you kind of look at this and kind of figure out that maybe the Red Bull had a slightly less upward momentum on that trend line as they were compared to the Mercedes. Mercedes had a slightly higher trend line, so they were getting slightly better than probably just the GP races. And McLaren was still in that downward spiral, but still able to outdo both of those teams, do that great start of the season, and maintain that, even though they were getting less points, still gaining points on a significant basis compared to the other teams. And here's that same information in step graph format. So again, you basically see McLaren, off in the lead quite as significantly, where that battle between the Mercedes and the Red Bull were playing out a little bit more, but not quite as well we saw in the sprint races, but more along the lines of the GP races. That didn't, touch the lines occasionally here and there, but not really swapping positions like we saw in the sprint races. So Mercedes was able to pretty much edge out Red Bull throughout this whole season, even though there was a couple of times when potentially they could have swapped positions. And what's coming up next is, of course, the deep dive into McLaren, where we'll be comparing them mainly to Red Bull, but we'll get a little bit of other information in there as well, and how well they're doing. So if you kind of like this data and you would appreciate it if you would give me a like, and I subscribe if you want to make sure you get those notifications so that you can get the deep dive when it comes out for McLaren. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.